Hello. What, in his own words, was the most blessed thing that ever happened to C.S. Lewis? Well, the answer is forgiveness. He did struggle for most of his life with forgiving someone else, and I'll come to that later. But he says in a couple of letters that he only truly appreciated being forgiven in his 50s. That's even after he'd been a Christian for 20 years, you see. He says to a Catholic priest he used to correspond with, Father Calabria, "During the past year, a great joy has befallen me. It is astonishing that sometimes we believe what really in our hearts we do not believe." For a long time I believed that I believed in the forgiveness of sins, but suddenly, on St. Mark's Day, this truth appeared in my mind in so clear a light that I perceived that never before, and that after many confessions and absolutions, had I believed it with my whole heart. It can be very different, he says, what we believe with our minds, with our intellects, and what is fixed in our very marrow by faith. He calls what happened to him a deliverance. He wonders if it happened because the priest had been praying for him. He even advises the priest not to dwell overmuch on his own sins, because St. Paul tells us to rejoice and always rejoice. Jesus has cancelled the handwriting which was against us, Lewis says. Lift up our hearts. He'd thought he believed it, you see, but on St. Mark's Day, and that's the 25th of April 1951, a very precise date, it became a wonderful, tangible reality. We don't know what happened on that day to trigger the revelation in his spirit, but he was still telling people about it 3 years later. So, for instance, he wrote to someone saying it was perhaps the most blessed thing that ever happened to me. And he writes again about the progress he made from mere intellectual acceptance of to realization of the doctrine that our sins are forgiven. I really think that this deep inner knowledge of being forgiven was something he grappled with perhaps later in life, because it comes up in all the Narnia stories. In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when Peter comes face to face with Aslan for the first time, he feels compelled to make a confession. "It was partly my fault," he blurts out, that Edmund went astray because I was angry with him. And how does the lion respond to his confession? Well, Aslan just looks at him and says nothing. And it seemed to all of them that there was nothing to be said, we're told. And this is pretty much how it is with his namesake Peter in St. Luke's Gospel. When Peter falls at Jesus' feet on the shores of Lake Galilee and says, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man," what does Jesus reply? Nothing. At least nothing that we're told in Luke's Gospel. In fact, the next thing he's saying is, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll fish for people." In The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when the traitor Edmund's turn comes for a conversation with Aslan, it puts everything right. And it's pretty clear that it's no one's business to ask any further questions. There is no need to tell you, and no one ever heard, what Aslan was saying, but it was a conversation which Edmund never forgot. In Prince Caspian, Peter and Susan refuse to believe that Lucy has seen Aslan. Well, deep down, Susan does, but she won't admit it. Afterwards, she's ready to apologise to Lucy, but she dreads meeting Aslan. What will she say to him? Well, perhaps you won't need to say much, suggests Lucy kindly. And that's more or less how it turns out. Aslan does the talking. "You have listened to fears, child," he says. "Forget them." And he breathes on the tearful Susan. And that's it. Again, Peter readily confesses his failure. "I'm sorry," he says. "I've been leading them wrong ever since we started." "My dear son," is all Aslan says to him. "My dear son." This is very important, I think. Lewis is giving us an insight into how Christ deals with us. Trumpkin the dwarf in the same story doesn't even believe in Aslan. When he eventually comes face to face with the lion, it's a roar and a toss in the air, followed by, "Son of Earth, shall we be friends?" Everyone's dealt with slightly differently. And it's in all the books. When Jill meets Aslan again at the end of the silver chair, she's conscious of completely failing to keep almost all the instructions that he'd given her for rescuing Prince Rilian. She wants to say sorry, but she's unable to speak. And what happens? Aslan draws her towards him with his eyes, we're told, and he says, "Think of that no more. I will not always be scolding." And he goes on to say, "You've done the work for which I sent you into Narnia," which is almost a well done, good and faithful servant moment. In The Magician's Nephew, Diggory has a bit of a grilling from Aslan until he's plumbed the reality of his own failure when, through his own silliness, he woke the evil witch Jadis from her slumber and brought her into Narnia. But after he's come face to face with his own wrong, Aslan gives him not a reprimand, but trusts him with a task which will help protect Narnia for many years to come. And then there's the conceited horse, Bree, in The Horse and His Boy, and Puzzle, the naive donkey, in The Last Battle. They each have their blessed encounter with the lion. And after they come humbly to him, the end result is love, acceptance, forgiveness. Realising that deep inside was, Lewis said, the most blessed thing that ever happened to me. Now, truly appreciating being forgiven is one thing, but it works both ways, and to forgive others can also bring joy and release. Only months before he died in 1963, Lewis wrote to an American woman who seems to have been finding it difficult to forgive her son-in-law, and he says to her, "Do you know, only a few weeks ago I realised suddenly that I at last had forgiven the cruel schoolmaster who so darkened my childhood. I've been trying to do it for years, and like you, each time I thought I'd done it, I found after a week or so it all had to be done again. But this time I feel sure it was the real thing." And he was referring to Robert Capron, the headmaster of the boarding school in Hertfordshire that he was sent to as a child more than 50 years before. It took him that long to feel he'd truly forgiven the man, after many attempts to do so. The head teacher was known for his extreme rages and physical violence. I say more about Lewis's unhappy school experiences in another video. Escaping school became a kind of metaphor of salvation for him. In Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, the narrator enthusiastically tells a similar story of forgiveness to the fictional Malcolm. "I really must digress to tell you a bit of good news," the 20th letter begins. And that book was published the year after Lewis died, and it's obvious he was using his own experience. He says, trying to forgive was like longing for a noisy neighbour to turn off their radio, and then suddenly it goes silent. Or trying for months to learn to swim, and it just seems impossible, and then suddenly it happens. What had seemed impossible for so long had suddenly been done. Last week, while at prayer, I suddenly discovered, or felt as if I did, that I had forgiven someone I have been trying to forgive for over 30 years, trying and praying that I might. When the thing actually happened, suddenly as the longed-for cessation of one's neighbour's radio, my feeling was, "But it's so easy. Why didn't you do it ages ago?" So many things are done easily the moment you can do them at all. But till then, sheerly impossible, like learning to swim. There are months during which no efforts will keep you up. And then comes the day and hour and minute after which, and ever after, it becomes almost impossible to sink. It also seemed to me that forgiving that man's cruelty and being forgiven, my resentment, were the same thing. Forgive and you shall be forgiven sounds like a bargain, but perhaps it's something much more. He goes on. The important thing is that a discord has been resolved, and it's certainly the great resolver who has done it. In other words, it's something we need God's help to accomplish. It's a discord resolved. A most blessed thing